So in English, the ultimate product that the students were coming up with was a podcast. It was going to be a podcast dealing with the overall driving question about how could we inspire an audience to reduce their impact on the earth. So where we started was with our first C, which is care. So we wanted to develop care within the students. So before we even got into the podcast project, we did a 3-week reading of a cli-fi book, which is climate fiction. Students had a choice of 6 different books in that genre, where they read those books that described what could become of the earth, what the future could look like on earth if climate change continues at the rate that it's going now. So once they read those books, they were ready for the podcast. Another piece that we used for care as well is we showed some videos of people doing various personal environmental challenges, like giving up meat for a week or trying to stop using plastic as much as possible, those kinds of things. So that also helped to develop their care. The next C that we worked on was conceptualize. So they were given the assignment of creating a podcast, but within the parameters of that podcast, they had a lot of freedom of choice of what they were going to do, what kind of challenge they were going to do, and how they were going to go about recording it, how they were going to keep track of their progress through the challenge, how they were going to interview each other. So they also had to develop the interview questions that they would ask themselves and ask each other before, during, and after the challenge. So that was all rolled into the conceptualized portion of the project. Once they got that out of the way, we moved into creation, and they were divided up into roles. Each person in the group, a group of 4 to 5 students, had a role. So the different roles were, there was a writer who was responsible for writing the intro, the outro to the podcast, as well as writing any narration that would go on throughout the body of the podcast. There was the documenter who was in charge of documenting the whole process of making the podcast, as well as creating a visual representation of the podcast to go along with it. They did that on Google Slides. There was the host who was responsible for being the voice of the podcast, doing the interviews, as well as talking through the intro and outro. And then probably the hardest job was the sound engineer, who had to put it all together at the end. So throughout that creation process, they were responsible for recording and interviewing each other, for doing all the written portion of the podcast, for doing the editing, and they had deliverables along the way. It was a 3-week process from beginning to end to get the podcast made. So each week they had a deliverable that they had to produce along the way as a checkpoint. And throughout the process, we have the 4th C, which is critique. So that was the idea of getting feedback on their work so far. And there were several stages of critique. First of all, within the group, after the first draft of the podcast was made, they had a critique session within their group. Then once they got to the second draft, there was a critique session between 2 different groups within the class. After they had pretty much their final draft ready, they did a critique session with some of our 10th grade students who listened to the podcast, as well as listened to their presentation, and gave them feedback on how they had done with the presentation as well as the podcast. And then finally, right before exhibition, we did a whole class feedback session where the students played their podcast and gave a short presentation on it to the rest of the class and got feedback from their whole class leading up to exhibition night. And those were the 4 C's in action within the podcast project portion of the Save the Earth project.